Welcome to Women and Resistance, a powerful podcast where we honor the courage, resilience, and revolutionary spirits of women across the globe. Hosted by Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, we uncover untold stories of defiance against systemic oppression, whether colonialism, racism, sexism, or economic injustice. From historic icons like Winnie Mandela and Fannie Lou Hamer to today's trailblazers, we shine a light upon those shaping a more just world. This is a call to honor the past, embrace the present, and build an empowered future. Greetings, and welcome to another episode of Women and Resistance. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me as usual is Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire. Before she goes into character, today's Women and Resistance, what we do here is celebrate women who have contributed in no small measure to the liberation of us as a people. And tonight, the focus would be on the eastern board of the African continent, specifically a port town on the Indian Ocean. I will not want to steal the thunder from our guests. Just to say, growing up was not as straightforward as anyone would want, as she would want. Because in the 1810s, she was taken from her home on Pat Island. Some say kidnapped, some say she eloped with a man. Her family had refused. Either way, what follows is the next 10 years that her own poetry would eventually call slavery. For that and more, let's go and speak to today's guest, who is Dada Masiti. Welcome, ma'am.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, good morning on this side of the world, good afternoon wherever you are. The question some would ask is, who is Dada Masiti?
I'm so honored to be with you tonight, or whenever it is that you're watching, because I understand that your technology is such that I speak today and you keep hearing me. I know that is a common thing for you all today, but that was not a common thing in my time. Where shall I begin my story? Somewhere off the southern coast of what is now called Somalia, where the Indian Ocean turns the color of hammered brass at sunset, there is a beautiful town called Barawa. For 1,000 years, boats have come and gone from its harbor, carrying ivory, myrrh, cloth, scholars, sailors, and unfortunately, for centuries, carrying human beings sold as cargo. It was in this place, sometime in the first decades of the 19th century, that I was born into a family who can trace its lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad himself. You must understand that for the most part, ours was an oral tradition. And so much of what is known about my life has been passed down from generation to generation, just mouth to ear. But there were also some clues that I left in the poetry for which I am known. I fell in love against my family wishes. You must orient this story in the time of which I speak. But there are some things that are universal. Young love, the all-knowing feeling that nothing is impossible for you. And I went away with my new husband, and I was taken to an island where that marriage and love became a decade of bondage. Even as I think about those years in captivity, cut off from my family, I know that my fate was still so much better than those who were shipped away from their families forever, and some who died in the process. Today, you might know of a place called Oman,
Middle East.
the area that I was taken into captivity. The Oman elites, leaders had taken over, and there was a very robust slave, as they will call it, trade by the Arabs over the Indian Ocean. Much of what in the Western world now is focused on when we talk about slavery pertains to the slavery that began with the Portuguese across the Atlantic Ocean. But before that, there was the slavery across the Indian Ocean.
Okay.
Mostly controlled by the Arabs, or those that are called Arabs today. But I survived it all. I survived it, and I became one of the most beloved saints, teachers, and poets. And I say that with great humility and deep gratitude. But in the history of East African Islam, my name is known. I was born Masiti Habib Jamaluddin. History remembers me by a name, a term of endearment given to me out of love and reverence. Many of you have one name, maybe, that the government calls you, and you have the name that your loved ones call you. That name that I was given is Dada Masiti. Some called me Sister Masiti. Before I tell you more about my life, let me tell you about where I was born. Because Barawa made me as much as my own family did, which is true for all of you who might be listening. Your family, your environment shapes you. Very important that when we work with the young people, we don't just look at how they are. We try to understand how they came to be. My people had been calling Barawa home in one form or another for over 1,000 years before I was born. The Arab writers, the geographers writing in the 12th century already knew of us. They called the town Barawa. And in their writings, they highlighted our mosques and our trade. We were a devout people. We were a spiritual people. Long before that, our ancestors had built coral stone houses. We're not a backwater people. And there were small mosques stretched all along the coast. In fact, most of what we now call the Swahili, that much older Swahili-speaking world, stretched from the Lamu Archipelago through Mombasa, Zanzibar, and beyond. This was a civilization that was built by the Bantu-speaking peoples of this coastal area.
Okay.
Then, over centuries, intermarrying with Arab, Persian, and later Portuguese and Indian settlers who were mostly financiers. You see, they play a certain role, as they played also in South Africa. I say that so that you conjure up in your mind what I'm speaking of, and you connect the dots to other pockets of knowledge that you already know and have about the continent of what is now called Africa. By the time the great medieval geographers, those scholars were calling Barawa one of the 3 most important towns on the entire coast. That's where I was born. Those 3 towns were Barawa, Mogadishu, and America. All 3 known equally for trade and for Islamic learning. And we had our own language, Chimini. Some called it Chimbalazi, a dialect of Swahili so old that it preserves words and sounds that have now vanished from other Swahili dialects. Form of governance wasn't that of a king, but we had councils of elders. You could describe us as, how would I put it, like an oligarchic little republic perched on the edge of the Indian Ocean. We had ivory. We had frankincense, myrrh, finely woven cloth, and we would trade it for porcelain from China, textiles from India, and spices from Arabia. It was into this world that I was born, into the Mahadali Ashraf clan. of Barawa, a family that carried the honored title of Sharif, like I said, meaning that we could trace our lineage to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Asharif families of Barawa were treated with a peculiar respect, and our family was known and trusted. I tell you all of this so that you can then juxtapose it with what happens in my life. But I want to say something that many scholars who write about me tend to skip.
Which is?
Lineage protects a woman far less than people like to believe or imagine. I was raised surrounded by scholars, by the sound of the Qur'an, recited from memory in our streets and our courtyards. Our oral culture meant that poetry and scripture both moved from mouth to mouth as much as from page to page. Before many of us, those who learned to read before we could read, we were already schooled in the art of memorization. And I knew a lot of our scripture. And yet none of that saved me from what came next. Barawa itself passed from the hands of several regional powers over time. First, we had the Sunni Sultanate, founded by a saint figure remembered as Ali. Then, roughly from the 13th century, we had the Ajuran Sultanate, which was a powerful Somali Muslim state that controlled much of southern Somalia through, and you must go and study this, because when we don't remember who we are, you think of Somalia today, and I understand that in the country, United States of America, you have a leader who heaps insults on Somalia. And the Somalian people may not even know the remarkable feats of engineering, including irrigation systems and a strong navy that in the early 16th century helped to repel the Portuguese incursions along that stretch of the coast. We must know a true history. Later, this area, Barawa, also came under the influence of the Geledi Sultanate, which used the town as its chief port. Through all of these political changes, something stayed constant. Barawa's identity as an Islamic island, a place where craftsmen wove fine cloth known as alindi, carved elaborate Qur'an stands and wedding furniture from wood, and quietly trained generations of religious scholars whose influence then spread far beyond the borders of this small island. By the time I was born, our Sufi scholarly tradition was centuries deep, and so many were produced during my time, and I would become one of our greatest poets. But first, I had to survive becoming part of it. I married without my family's blessings. What an abomination. And I went with my love away from Barawa entirely, across the water to Pate, a small island in what is now known as Kenya. A century before I arrived there, it had been a jewel of this coast. A city of poets, fine carved doors, elaborate architecture, and some of the most celebrated literary culture in the entire Swahili world. But that golden age had ended before my birth, a generation before my birth, torn apart by the same things tearing us apart today: massacres and internal warfare between rival ruling families. I know you asked me about me, but I told you I'm a product of my environment, and we must understand our history so we understand how we repeat it, because what happened with all that warfare and fighting amongst people who should have been brothers and sisters was that place became an area of crumbling houses and faded memories. My marriage mirrored that island, ruin for ruin. The man I chose did not give me a home. He gave me a decade of captivity. No family, cut off from my language, cut off from anyone who would call me by my name. But of course, I'm not alone, because many today do not know their names. Erasure. People who tell my story gently sometimes would say it was a difficult marriage. Those are kind words for what I experienced. In my own poetry, I wrote these words about that time. This world has deceived me, and I have become a destitute slave. Me, a noble woman, a descendant of the great prophet, may peace be upon him, enslaved in what I had thought would be a marriage. Most people, like I said, when they hear slavery, they picture the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, the plantations of the Americas, but far fewer. In fact, I want to ask you, how much do you know about the trade that ran in the opposite direction, out of the same African coastline, and for far longer, older than its Atlantic counterpart, by hundreds of years, and some argue comparable in scale, even though it receives but a tiny bit of attention. Historians have traced organized trafficking, kidnapping, enslavement, murder of East Africans across the Indian Ocean back over 1,000 years into Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. Some researchers estimate that across the full sweep of this trade from roughly 1500 to 1900, somewhere in the range of 15 to 17 million people were taken from East Africa and the wider Indian Ocean world, that whole world combined. We can debate the numbers, but we should never doubt the pain in the suffering. I wish I could tell you that this was a trade conducted, as they would say, at arm's length by distant strangers, but actually it moved through local economies.
Shame.
Local elites, and I write about this in my poetry. For those of you inclined to do some research, the British colonial records from maybe about the 1840s describe Oromo people captured by Somali raiders and sold into Arabian markets, with prices for women recorded. So when you read today about the continued maltreatment of African peoples across the Arab world, you know that that is not a thing that began today. This human trade was recorded in the same ledgers and the same inhumane ledger language used for livestock. I must admit, Somali coastal towns, just like some coastal towns in West Africa, were not innocent bystanders of this system. Sometimes they were victims, and in the case of certain elites,
active participants,
some of them were participants for profit. By the early 19th century, the century of my birth, this entire trade was converging on a single island that would soon swallow me: Zanzibar. Today, when you hear Zanzibar, what comes to mind? Ooh, gonna be what? What
The
comes to mind for you?
holidays,
Yes, tourist.
picturesque water.
Yes, let us go and relax and have a good time. But a good time is not what I had in Zanzibar during my captivity. I was a slave on the verge of drowning, but a family member, after a decade, saw me and recognized me and rescued me out of a darkness I had no idea how to escape. I had no money. I was a woman, no family nearby, in a city known for slave trading. human trafficking. I was of no status, but like I said, I was saved. The family member who rescued me was my maternal cousin, Omar Kulatin. He found me in that city of strangers and he brought me home. I have never stopped being grateful for what I called in my poem the Ummah, the ordinary virtuous people of strong faith who did what their faith asked of them and came looking for one of their own. In a port where looking for anyone at all was an act of great courage. In another part of my poem I wrote, they promised to take me back, for they were from the Prophet Muhammad's Ummah, virtuous people of strong faith. My escape, my rescue did not come from government or a court or any law. It came from kinship and from a faith that is practiced as a verb, not a noun. How much faith do you have? How do you practice it? All you who say you are spiritual people. Britain would not formally pressure Zanzibar's sultans into a series of treaties restricting this human trafficking until the 1820s, and slavery would not be abolished in this area until 1897, and even then it continued. What becomes of a woman who eloped against her family's wishes in those times, whose marriage collapsed, who returned home having been enslaved? What could she expect? I was ready for anything was better than slavery. The expectation would be that you would be shunned, blamed, tarred and feathered, treated as a cautionary tale for other young women.
True.
Some of you do that to the young people who have made less than wise choices. Some of you bear the scars of how you've been treated when you made choices that put you into a darkness you could not have foreseen. But my community, my people of faith, they did something else. They let me in. Even more astoundingly, they let me lead. As you can imagine, when I returned to Barawa, it was like a rebirth. Yes, you don't go through something of that nature and not come out changed. Now that change can set you down a path of such deep shame and self-loathing and an internal darkness that overcomes you, though you have left your physical chains. But that is not the path I chose. Met a teacher, Sheikh Mohammed Jana Al-Bahluli, and through him I was initiated
You are listening to Women and Resistance with Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, where we honor the voices of women who have shaped history through courage and defiance. If you're finding these stories inspiring, take a moment to subscribe, share, and support this platform. Together, we amplify the voices that deserve to be heard. Now, back to the conversation.
into the Qadiriyya, the Sufi order that traces its lineage back to the great 12th century saint Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. This was a path built on remembrance of God, discipline of the self, and service to others. I don't care if you are listening to me at any point in time, what your professed religion or form of spirituality may be. But if you embrace a path built on the remembrance of God, discipline of yourself, your mind, your body, and your spirit, many of you are very undisciplined. And the results are evident in your life. And the third thing, so I said, remembrance of God,
Discipline,
self-discipline, and service to others, not enrichment of self. If you do these three things, I guarantee you, your life will be one of great and meaningful impact. There's so much to share with you. The Qadiriya and a related order that grew directly out of Barawa, called the Uwasiya, named for its founder, became one of the dominant spiritual forces across southern Somalia and well beyond it during my lifetime and afterwards as well. In fact, our leader would later organize resistance against the Italian colonial administration that seized Barawa in 1908 and was killed the following year in a dispute with another religious leader. My people,
Internal division.
I guess this is proof that the spiritual life is never totally separated from the political life. So for those of you who would want to bury your head, I do one and not the other. That is foolhardy at best. But his followers, even after his death, carried our word, our way of being, the order across East Africa, building religious communities, Jama, throughout the riverine regions of southern Somalia. I'm telling you this because I was part of something much larger than my own private healing in service to others. And in time, with that discipline, I rose to a position of real respect and leadership in that community. I did not seek to remarry. I did not seek to have children. I was committed to my path. So much so that in one of my poems, I wrote these words. I was a commander, a governor. I used to give orders. I used to make decisions. I wrote this as a much older woman, with my knees and my joints creaking every time I attempted to move. I did not say this in my poem to boast, because facts are facts. I said it because I want every woman listening to this, in whatever country, whatever century, to understand those particular words: commander, governor. Of course, these are translations from my language in which I wrote. These were words I used as an old woman to describe what I had lived. These are not words that a community gives to someone it is merely tolerating. They are words given to someone they have chosen to follow. And today, I look around, even amongst those who practice my faith, and I wonder, how did we get to a point where we're going to challenge whether a woman can command or lead? I was a teacher and a poet, and I composed my poetry not in the elevated Arabic language, the language reserved for scholars, for the powerful, for men trained in the religious sciences. No, I wrote it in Chimini, the everyday dialect spoken by every person in Barawa, scholar, farmer, man, woman, child, free and once enslaved, all alike, because I wanted my teaching to be accessible to all. And that in and of itself was a radical act. In those days, the religious sciences were largely the property of men who had studied formally, often in Arabic, often outside of our area. Women were kept apart from those spaces, segregated from the study halls, the formal study halls. But poetry sung at a gathering, recited at a funeral, passed from a mother's mouth to her daughter's memory, and it belonged to everyone. By writing in the language of my people, I made sure that the deepest truths of our faith, of our culture, of our history, both the outward law, which you know as Sharia, and the inward path of purifying the heart, could travel into homes, even if formal scholarship never reached them. I have been told and I have seen that because of the path I and women like me opened, the Quran teachers in the madras of Barawa today are in great majority women. That fact, more than the poetry I've written, is what I hope to be remembered. There came a day when the most respected judge of our community, Kadi Nurian Al-Sabur, felt his own death drawing near. And he came to me, a woman once cast out by her own marriage, a woman once enslaved, and he asked that I compose something to console our people when he is gone. Because death is something that comes to us all, not something to be feared. And I wrote Bakda Hayi after. In it, I told my people, don't collapse into the kind of grief that would cause a community to unravel, but instead turn towards remembrance. When the sheikh dies, no one should weep. Instead, people should recite the words from the Qur'an. I reminded them that death, understood rightly, is not loss. Listen, for in this you will understand our culture. Death, understood rightly, is a returning, a reunion with the beloved we have been seeking all along, and that a day of mourning should instead be a day of joy. Distributing roasted coffee beans at the gatherings. Because in like manner as I wrote, in fact, I will read it directly for you, they would distribute heavenly rewards, much like roasted coffee beans are distributed. I also use that poem in our language, accessible to all, to remind our people through verse rather than sermon the reward promised to those who walk in a funeral procession, a teaching handed down through the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him. An oral community deep in mourning does not have the patience for a lecture. It will, though, sit still for a poem. There are many scholars today studying my work, what is survived of what they will call the corpus. Much of it was preserved through the work of researcher Mohammed Qasim, and he claims that there are two broad threads running through my poetry. It is concerned with the outward practices and obligations of the faith, the inward mystical path of purifying the soul. And in these days, is there ever a call for the purification of the soul? Because to be in these bodies that we are in, that I am in, or that looks like what I was in when I still walk this earth, to watch the devastation still befalling us, could cause one to turn inside out with anger. And that anger can be all-consuming. So we must do the inward mystical work of purifying the soul. And death is a union rather than an ending. There's a lady they like to sometimes compare me to in Iraq, Rabia al-Adawiya, from the 8th century, considered a saint in Basra, were remembered as having been enslaved at some point and then eventually finding freedom and turning towards devotion. Rabia of Basra, her name is invoked in sermons from Morocco to Indonesia. Her sayings quoted by scholars who have never set foot near what is now called Iraq. But for me, I remain known in Somalia, but barely known outside of that area. I ask you, had you ever heard of me? Now, there are a few who have been scattered across Kenya, the Gulf, Europe, some areas of North America that may still remember, that are still studying my work. But I think the greater issue here is that Somalia's own history has been unjustly dismissed in the public conscience of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, overshadowed, especially in the more recent time, by endless war, famine, instability. And so these images, this narrative, crowds out what is a millennium of poetry and scholarship and sainthood. And I beseech my people to return and to remember, for it will be a pathway out of where we are now. Let me share this with you as I round up. And I would lovingly take questions from you and from those who have given me an opportunity to share with you today. I wrote, "My home is the grave. For me, it is better. Place of sand and sand hills where there are no friends and siblings. By most accounts, I lived to a very old age, into my 90s. Some say I died about the year 1920. I watched Barawa pass from independent rule under regional sultans into an Italian protectorate in 1908, and finally into full incorporation as part of Italian Somaliland in 1910. Do you know we are still feuding today? These colonial histories that are like viruses buried within us. I had outlived an entire generation of scholars I once studied alongside. And when I died, I was buried close to my small home in Barawa, the same town that had once been ready to whisper about my failed marriage, and instead chose to call me a commander, governor, a teacher, a saint. And you know that today, every year, people go on an annual ziyarah, a pilgrimage of remembrance to my grave. A Somali Sufi scholar of the early 20th century once called me a treasure that must be jealously preserved. A century later, was that a warning? Was that a direct instruction? Yeah. And let me tell you, the 20th century has not been kind to Barawa or to my people. Our town's importance faded as Somalia's post-independence government invested in Mogadishu and Merka. This story, by the way, has played out in many other countries, places that were thriving at one time. But the colonizers then choose, no, we're going to invest in a different place, usually to keep areas weakened and fighting each other. In 1991, when the Somalian Civil War broke out, Barawa, like so much of Somali, became a battle zone, changing hands back and forth between rival armed factions because we did not learn. My people, who are called the Bravanese, as a small urban mixed heritage minority, without the protection of the large pastoral clan networks, we're very vulnerable. Some fled to Kenya, the Gulf, the wider diaspora. I would be interested to know whether anybody from that area or a descendant of someone from that area will hear my words today and say, yes, I'm from. And you know my ancient language, Chimini?
Go on, tell us.
It is now considered endangered. Spoken maybe 25 to 30,000 people in the entire world. Most of them not even living in that same area. I know this goes beyond the scope of my life, but I'm telling you this so you connect the importance of everything you hear. There's always a connection. In 2009, there was an even more specific assault on us. Al-Shabaab seized control of Barawa itself and held it for 5 years. Cultural attacks, destruction of our tombs, the closure of our mosques, the detention of the sheikhs, the silencing of our devotional and Sufi traditions, the erasure. This was not some abstract extremism that was striking our town or a random town. It was an assault on the specific religious culture, Sufi, syncretic, women inclusive, that I and other Brabanese scholars had spent centuries cultivating. This came after over 2 decades of kidnapping, forced marriage, and rape of women and young girls that echo my lived experience. This is happening to my daughters 2 centuries later. Well, the Somali National Army and the African Union forces, they liberated Barawa in 2014 as a part of a broader coastal offensive. And today we're under government administration. And all of this, even with the annual pilgrimage, has even impacted the numbers who come. I promise this is the last thing I will share with you. I told you that I studied with scholars and I wrote extensively, and my poems are still in existence. But do you know that in 2024, a report from the IMF found that over between 45 to 65% of adult Somali women don't have basic literacy skills. That same survey found that across the country, about 65% of the population has no formal education at all. And those with the formal education are concentrated in the cities. So when you get out into the more remote rural areas, that level of lack of formal education is even higher. And the gap is not only, the literacy rate is not just low, it is gendered, because you will always see a higher percentage of women without education, without those basic literacy skills than men. But my daughters are organizing. They are fighting against female genital mutilation. The Somali women are pushing for change, pushing for a 30% quota of parliamentary seats, because if I could be a governor and lead, so should my daughters. I think I will stop there so that if you have any questions, I can answer your questions.
I have one quick question. You mentioned that it was your choice not to remarry, because in this context, you see it as an assertion of self-determination rather than simply an absence of romantic life. The question is, while you were doing the work, how did you not feel the need to, quote unquote, complete your being as a woman in that kind of society, knowing what kind of society exists in Barawa?
Well, here comes that inner purification work. We do not have to define ourselves just by what society demands, even though it is important for society to have norms and traditions, of course, very important. But there is room for all of us, or there should be, based on our particular calling and purpose. And for me, when I told you I was reborn, similar to those who give their lives in the Christian faith as nuns or as priests, I felt that this was my calling, and I felt no lack whatsoever. When you are on that path of obedience to God, when you are well disciplined in self, and particularly when you are committed to service to others, some of the same benefits that may be derived from the companionship of a marriage or from birthing children can also be derived from these 3 things that I have laid out to you. And the connections as you serve people can fill every need that you may have, if that is your calling. But I would not say that anyone should pattern their life based on someone else's calling, you see.
So one final question, and that will go to your poetry. Do you have any poetry that's relevant to our times? We're talking 2026 now, that you could read for people to mull over and think about.
Well, I think that all my poetry can be relevant to our times.
So I'm just...
Let me see if there is one in particular that I will share for you. Give me a second. I've already shared bits and pieces from some of them. Because death comes to us all, I think I will share in full the Bakdahai afterlife that I wrote.
Okay.
Of course, I will be saying it in English, although it was written in my language. And when the Shaykh dies, no one should weep. Instead, people should recite the Dhikr. It will echo from all corners, and the Quran will be read. Why should people weep? As it is a day of joy. The day he dies is actually a day of joy, and a day to visit each other in celebration. And then a divine call can be made for the crowd to be rewarded. Angels will descend to perform this service. They will distribute heavenly rewards, much like roasted coffee beans are distributed. And I wanted to share that because, again, death comes to us all. Some of you may have lost, as you would say in your language, but it is not a loss. Some of you have buried your loved ones who have gone on that journey into the ancestral realms. Some of you, as you went through that process, did not see it as a day of joy or as a day to visit each other in celebration. That line alone, again, speaks to our form of spirituality and culture, that the mourning is done as a collective, but it is actually a celebration. That you do not lock yourself up in a room with the lights off and cry yourself into a depression. No, you visit with each other in celebration of the... And so that is the poem that I wanted to share with you today.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sure you've shed light on context, life on the eastern border of Africa with its interaction with the other side of the Indian Ocean. Also gives us a window into understanding that the slave trade was not just one side of the continent, but both sides, which I think is a less known fact and less talked about, of course, wherein it lasted for 1,000 years as opposed to 400 years on the western side. That said, we have come to the end of...
I see that there's some questions. May I attempt to answer the questions?
Let me check. Yes. Okay. You want to take a stab at it?
How can we be helpful without overstepping or disrespecting your culture? You know, without giving a whole treatise on it, what I would say is, how would you like people to come to and learn about your culture? A lot of times, the same way that you would want people to show respect is the same respect you can show to others. But I'll give you a very basic example. First, you observe and you attempt to study. And when you come amongst people who might have a different culture than yours, you don't assume that you know and understand and that you are there to maybe teach or change them. So if you come around and you see me dressed in the manner that I am, perhaps to some degree you mimic that dressing, not because the culture requires of you to not be who you are, but just out of a respect of the traditions of that place that you live in. I see so many people who come in to what is now this modern day area where they just come and trample over the existing culture and care nothing about it. So I would say study, observe, show respect in your mannerisms. If when you see people greet, they greet by bending a knee, does not cost you anything to bend that knee. It doesn't mean you're less than who you were. Now, I'm not saying mimic anything that debases you, of course. But I recall, even in the Bible, did you not have someone called Paul? And the question I think was posed, can he eat something that is considered unclean within his culture? And it says, if you're amongst those people, if you're a person of faith, you pray over it and you eat it out of respect. Doesn't mean when you go back to your house, you must continue in that way.
Yeah.
So I would say study, observe, mimic, and then when people see your genuine respect, they will welcome you. You can now ask questions after a relationship has been built. These are not things done in the public. These are things done one-on-one in the sanctitude, this is your word, of a relationship. You understand?
Mm-hmm.
Now, another question is my headdress. I appreciate you calling it that. Of course, I am a Muslim woman, and we, in our culture, cover our hair and most of our body. The color red for me was a daily reminder of what I had been rescued from, saved from, and a call to continuous sacrifice, if you will. What does the color evoke for you as you see it?
Well, red in life is resistance. It's also a flag of war. So depending on the context, which is also very key. So if you're...
Some may look at it as war, maybe an understanding of connection to blood, to lineage, and the need to always remember.
There's that.
And to move accordingly. And if we understand we are of one blood, then perhaps it would not be so easy to be divided and to then spill that blood indiscriminately in pursuit of
position, material things.
Nothing that is of lasting value. And that blood, that inner purification, could solve all of Africa's problems.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Dada Masiti, for coming through. And with that, we've come to the end of this week's episode of Women in Resistance. Next week, it will be the turn of Ida Gray. Who Ida Gray is, we'll find out in the course of next week's program. That said, any final thoughts?
You cannot effectively tell collective history of those of us considered of African descent if we will not tell the stories of our women folk. So I thank you for the manner in which you are lifting up so many like me for people to remember now and for the future. There is no one book, major book written about me. That is true for many of the women that you have
spoken to.
Yes, perhaps somebody will decide to take up that mantle and do that work, because our young women and our young men, our leaders for today and tomorrow, do need to know this collective history. And women and girls need to know you never need to wait for permission to be who your creator has designed you to be.
Well, you mentioned the role of women. We also have to bear in fact that on the African continent, women are the majority, and as a growing continent as well, 60% of the people between the ages of 18 and 35 are women. So thank you for coming through. Again, that said, until next week when we come around, it will be the turn of Ida Gray. I said Ida Wells. Ida Gray, and yes, there's a lot of Ida in the pantheon of great women. So, yeah, it's going to be a turn of Ida Gray. And until next week, I am Adesoji Iginla, and it's good night and God bless. That is it for this episode of Women and Resistance. Thank you for joining us in amplifying the voices of women who challenged injustice and changed the course of history. Be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. Together, remember, we honor the past, act in the present, and shape the future. Until next time, stay inspired and stay in resistance.